For the first part of this assessment, we're going to be using Sheet 1. The first step is to sort the list in alphabetical order. In order to do that, I'm going to highlight the data in the column A, and then I'm going to go over here to Sort and Filter. When I click on that arrow, then I'm going to choose Sort A to Z. And what that's going to do is put my information in order alphabetically. The second step I'm going to do is create headings. So I will put it in cell B3, and the first heading that I'm going to make is money. The second heading is permission slips, and the third is lunch choice. You'll notice that this particular column is not wide enough, so what I'm going to do is hover over the area in between C and D until I get this crosshair icon, and I'm going to hold the left side of the mouse down and stretch it. So again, if I want to make D larger, I'll put it in between the columns D and E, hold, and stretch in order to get the proper width. The last thing I'm going to do for this portion of the assessment is I'm going to add borders. So what I'll first do is highlight by using the left side of the mouse, holding it down and then letting go so that the area I want borders around is highlighted. And then I'm going to go up here to this icon and I'm going to click this arrow and I'm going to choose all borders. And that's going to allow me to put borders around each of the boxes. My last step in this portion of the assessment is to rename the sheet. In order to do this, you'll just right click down here, choose the word rename, and for this one we're going to call it checklist. And then I've completed part 1 of the assessment.
This video is part 2, continuing the topic of comparing actual and budget data in an Excel dashboard. Part 1 explained how to retrieve data into a dashboard like this from a Power Pivot model using Excel cube functions, but starting out with pivot tables. Part 2 focuses on how to produce the data to support sparkline charts. Sparkline charts first appeared in Excel in 2010, and they're not always lines. As you can see here, when I click on this cell, the Sparkline Tools tab lights up, but these are in fact column charts, not line charts. Oh, and the other thing we'll look at is adding KPI indicators for trend, whether in this case gross profit has gone up or down since last year, and comparison of actual to budget. So if you're displaying a Sparkline chart covering say 6 months, what you really need to have is 6 months worth of data in 6 adjacent cells, either across columns or down rows. So on another tab in this workbook, I've got some cube formula reports that retrieve the sales values by country for 6 months. I'll explain about how I make the months dynamic in a minute. So I'm starting out with a pivot table that has the data laid out roughly as I want it, 6 months worth of sales data. On the columns, I'm using something called time key, and I'm going to go into the Power Pivot model and just show you where that comes from. In the time table, as I call it anyway, I have a row for each month, but I also have something called time key, which is essentially just an integer and is the year followed by the month number, 01 for January, 12 for December. As it happens, I imported the data with the time key, but you can add your own time key as a calculated column using a little bit of DAX functionality, which is basically because this is a string, January 2009, I'm taking the date value, that converts it to a real date, and getting the year of that date value, which is 2009, and then multiplying it by 100. To that, I add the month of the date value of the month. And sorry, there's kind of confusing naming of columns and functions there. Don't be put off by this DAX syntax. You'll find that the exact same functions exist in Excel already. So back in Excel, I've converted my pivot table to a cube formula report. I've got my time keys here. I'm making these dynamic based upon the cell above. So you can see that this is pointed to cell C1, which is here, And C1 is just 1 subtracted from the column to the right. So we've got 201, 206. This is 201, 205. So this cell here is linked to the dashboard, and that's picking up the month that has been selected in the slicer. And then these are just 1 subtracted from that. The column on the right is the one that gives us the prior year. And instead of subtracting 1, we subtract 100, and that basically gets us down into the previous year. And to retrieve that prior year data, all I had to do was copy the cube functions from this column into this column. It's worth noting that if your moving range of dates goes into the prior year, then you need to accommodate that with an if statement that basically says if the right 2 digits of this month is 01, i.e. January, the first month of the year, then subtract 100 and add 11. That gets you back up to December of the prior year. Otherwise, subtract 1, which is what we've been doing all along. Where were we? Okay. So then I can copy this block of cube functions and put them down here. Okay, so why am I doing this? Well, I need to pull the budget values as well. So I'm going to change this measure to be revenues budget value. But that doesn't change anything because these cells are all still pointed at A1. So I'm going to do a global replace and make $A, $1 to be $A, $39. And now, let's close that. We've got the budget data, and as you may remember from the last time, we don't have budget data for Middle East and Africa yet. We can delete these cells because the cube functions here are still pointed to row C2, which is the column heading for the month key reference. Recapping then, I've got 6 months of sales data, which will actually dynamically change depending on which month I select, and I'll talk about that in a second. I've got the same corresponding month in the prior year, and further down I've got budget data, and finally I've tacked on some Excel functions which compare the actual gross margin to the budget gross margin and come up with a variance percent. So basically it's the actual gross margin minus the budget gross margin divided by the budget gross margin. That's all wrapped in an if error function so that if in the case like of Middle East and Africa we don't have data, it'll just return an empty string. So I've taken a couple of shortcuts here. Because I only have budget data for 2012 and because I want to go back 6 months and look at the trend, then I've created a slicer that only has selections for the last 6 months of 2012. That way there is 6 months of actual versus goal history. So to create a slicer with just those 6 months available for selection and not the 36 months which are available in the database because there's 36 months worth of actuals, I've created a simple linked table. And you can see here how I'm using the date value and the year and month functions to create what I call a time key. Here's the corresponding table in the Power Pivot model. So we can now create a pivot table from this time table, and we'll put it in a new worksheet. We'll scroll down to monthly selections and choose month and make that a slicer vertical. This is now a slicer that really isn't connected to any data, but we can use it. We can link it in with either other pivot tables or cube formula reports, and that's what we're going to do on the dashboard. Okay, so watch carefully. I've got the slicer here. I right click on it and look at slicer settings. That tells me that the name to use in formulas is slicer underscore month 3. Now, I'm pulling into a cell over on the right here the value that the slicer is returning. In this, and I'm using another cube function called CubeRankedMember, where I give it the data source, the slicer name, and the number 1, and that returns November 2012. And one reason for doing that there is so that I can use that name in the report title. So I'm tacking on N14, and that means the report title is dynamic. I have another helper cell here that wraps the name of the month in square brackets, and that's what I use to drive the cube value functions in the main body of the dashboard. Equally well, I could have simply put in the slicer name and that would have done the same job. I've added a couple of range names to my month selection sheets. The whole table I've called month selections, and then I've created a column for the month called month column. These I'm using in a helper cell which looks at the month, October 2012 in this case, and uses the combination of index and match to return the time key. And it's the time key here in cell 014 that gets used on the sheet that pulls the 6-month data for the spark lines. You may remember that we subtract 1 from this number to get the trailing 6 months. So that brings us full circle to where we started at the beginning of the video. Spark lines can be added by clicking on the Insert tab, and you can make a choice of different types of spark lines here. And if I click on the Sparkline Tools tab and Edit Data, you can see that the data range is these 6 cells here for Europe, and similarly for the other regions. For the gross margin percent actual versus budget, it's these formulas that we created at the bottom here. The KPI icon for this cell, currently a red diamond, represents the relationship of actual gross profit percent to budget gross profit percent. If actual is better than budget, then we get a green circle. If it's more than 5% below budget, we get a red diamond, and if it's within 5%, we get a yellow triangle. Finally, the trend icon in this cell here does a comparison to the gross margin percent in the same period in the prior year, and that we pulled on our 6-monthly cube formula report right here. This video is already far too long, so I'm going to assume that you either know how to do conditional formatting or use spark lines, or you'll find a resource that will explain it better than I will. In part 3, which I promise will be a shorter video, I'll explain how you can structure your Power Pivot model so that you can compare actual and budget data in a single pivot table, and that will make it easier when you come to build your cube formula reports. Thank you for watching.